Welcome to the Capone Files, a new series of videos here on Disorderly Product News in which we'll travel around the Chicagoland area showing you spots and telling you stories, some of the most historic stories of American gangster lore, of American mafia lore here in Chicago in regards to Al Capone and the Chicago outfit. First, we start out in Cicero, Illinois, a town Al Capone and his older brother Frank took over. Frank, a maniacal madman bent on murder and power. First, this video will take place on April Fool's 1924, Election Day in Cicero, Illinois. Frank Capone is bent on Al and his team retaining power. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the Capone Files. Here we are in Cicero, Illinois. It was right here, on this very corner, well, about a half a block south, on Cicero Avenue, just south of Cermak, where the American Mafia and the story of the American Mafia was changed forever. It was here on April Fool's 1924 that the older brother of Al Capone, Frank Capone, the much more sinister, the much more maniacal, the much more dangerous Capone brother and leader of the gang was killed. April Fool's 1924 was election day here in Cicero. The Capone and Torrio gang was kicked out of Chicago. They went running and they found a home here in Cicero. They had Mayor Cleenan, the Republican mayor who was in office, underneath their thumb. In fact, Scarface himself, Al Capone, slapped him in broad daylight and sent them flying down the village hall stairs. But it was here where younger brother Frank Capone died. On the night before the election, Frank Capone led a team of his gang to the office of Democratic William Pulfman, who was running for town clerk. Capone's gang roughed him up and destroyed his office. The Cicero police who were on the Capone payroll paid no mind to it. The following day was the actual election day, which saw even more turmoil. Frank Capone didn't want to leave his fortunes to chance. He sent his gang into Cicero to make sure citizens voted for Clinton instead of the opposition candidate. Now understand this. Al Capone's motto was, let's make a deal before we have to kill. Frank's motto was, you don't get no talk back from no corpse. So that goes to show you that Frank was the muscle. Frank was the man who left nothing to chance. If they didn't vote Republican, if they didn't vote Clinton, they were kidnapping him on this day. They sliced a man's throat. They shot a Democratic committeeman in the leg, and then bring him to a hotel and had 8 other Democrats watch over him till the election was over. By mid-afternoon, this is what happened. By mid-afternoon on election day, in what had turned out to be a chaotic scene, County Judge Edmund J. Jenkel deputized 70 officers to have jurisdiction in Cicero in a bid for Cicero residents to take back their town. 70 men were deputized to have jurisdiction in Cicero. They got into limousines and they got into cars. They were Chicago police officers, and they were trained by Chicago police officers who had already kicked the Capone gang out of Chicago, so they knew how to deal with this murderous gang. They went into limousines, unmarked cars, and cabs as a way to pass through every major thoroughfare that was guarded by the Capone gang secretly, having the ability to spring out on the Capone gang at the very last possible second. The cars pulled up right here on Cicero Avenue, right in front of us. I am standing where Frank Capone would be standing. Well, when the doors of the limousines opened up, Frank did not know if they were friend or foe. He did not know if they were the Irish gangsters from the north side, if they were the FBI, the police, but Frank Capone didn't care. He let loose with a couple shots. As soon as the doors opened, Frank let loose. Before Capone could fire again, he was fatally shot at point-blank range. Al Capone escaped the carnage and would run the family's empire from that point on. Had Frank waited until he could see who was coming out of those doors, it's very, very likely that Al himself would have been killed also. So both Capone brothers would have been killed had Frank not let loose with his gun. And there would be no Al Capone. Now, Frank was killed at 28 years of age. He's 4 years older than Al. Al was 24 years old at this time. So they were running Cicero at the ages of 28 and 24, but they were part of the Torrio gang. Johnny Torrio was the first outfit boss in Chicago. The outfit is what's the name for the Chicago Mafia. That's called the outfit. So here they are in at 28 years of age, on April Fool's 1924, Frank Capone shot dead in Cicero as there's mayhem going on at the ballot box, at the polling places, at the polling stations, and as Al Capone escapes with his life. But it happened here, 1924, April 1st. One of the biggest shots in the war for the American Mafia was fired here, April 4th, 1924. Frank Capone's killed. And the story is written where we know who the biggest gangster of all time is Al Capone. Had this not happened, had this event not taken place, we might be saying the name Frank Capone. Frank Capone might be the biggest gangster of all time, but he died very, very early on in the war. Frank's funeral was said to be that of an elder statesman, a prime minister, a president. 15 cars followed the procession, and they held all the flowers that people had donated and bought and sent in. It took 15 cars to hold the flowers. Al Capone himself had spent $20,000 on flowers, as it was his older brother who let off the shots to give him time to get away. Here in Cicero, Illinois, the town that Al Capone took over. If you ever see the movie The Untouchables with Robert De Niro as Al Capone, that hotel in which they're going in and delivering him his breakfast, but they stop at the accountant, and the accountant is writing down the numbers for all the barrels of booze and how much it costs, and he puts that paper in the side of the tray, and then they give the tray to Capone in his bed. That was meant to be the Hawthorne Hotel, which is right down the street from here, which I did a video on also. That hotel, as you saw, gangsters were leaving and call girls were running to kiss him goodbye in lingerie. It was debauchery and booze. It was his own little fiefdom. Al Capone took over Cicero. As you can imagine, it's a village, it's a town, it has its own police department, and if you run the mayor and you run the police department, who can tell you anything? Nobody but the feds or the state police. But Capone had such power that it wasn't until Mr. Ness was sent to tackle the problem of Al Capone in Chicago that it actually got solved. And it was on tax evasion charges that they got Al Capone. They couldn't get him on anything else because he didn't touch it. He didn't touch it. He didn't partake in it, right? If you don't touch the alcohol, if you're not there at the deals, how can you ever get convicted of anything? Especially with the way the laws were written back then. They didn't have RICO or conspiracy laws like they have now. A RICO law was made, and it was the most effective law in taking down and dismantling the outfit in Chicago and the mafia overall. It's the Racketeering and Corrupt Organizations Act. It's a way of saying you don't, as long as you're committing a crime to further a criminal organization, then everybody in that organization can be held responsible for that particular crime, as long as that crime can be proven to further the organization. So Al Capone could get charged with all these different things that his cohorts and his underlings and his subordinates did. But they didn't have that at the time. They used that later on in the Don's trial, the boss's trial in New York, where 4 of the 5 families' heads were put on trial as the Gambino family, the Lucchese family, the Bonanno family. I don't believe was on trial. They were kicked out of the commission at the time. It was called the commission trial. The Lucchese, the Colombo, the Gambino, and who was the last one? Oh, the Genovese, the Ivy League of organized crime, they call them. So they used the Racketeering Corrupt Organization Act to take down the Mafia, and that was the final nail in the coffin for the Mafia and the Chicago outfit. The Chicago outfits, they took their last breath at the Family Secrets trial, and I will be having the man who was front and center for the Family Secrets trial on Disorderly Product News. We will do a face-to-face interview. I will sit down with him in the same room with him and ask him questions. The man from the Family Secrets trial, I will be talking to him.